Welcome to a new episode of Sleep Journey Through Lost Worlds, your podcast for relaxing, letting go, and learning. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave a rating. It helps us produce more episodes. Then settle in, let your thoughts grow quiet, and allow yourself to be carried away. Tonight, we are traveling to one of the most enduring mysteries the human mind has ever conjured. We are going to Atlantis. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the surface of the ocean at night. The water is dark, vast, and still. Somewhere beneath those endless waves, according to one of history's most captivating stories, lies a civilization that was once greater than any other on Earth. A city of gold and knowledge, of magnificent temples and perfectly ordered streets, of a people so advanced that the gods themselves grew envious. A world that vanished in a single night, swallowed whole by the sea. This is the story of Atlantis. And it is one of the most fascinating intersections of mythology, philosophy, archaeology, geology, and human longing that has ever existed. Let us begin at the very source. The story of Atlantis does not come from ancient ruins or crumbling tablets. It does not come from oral traditions passed down across millennia. It comes from a single man, writing in the 4th century BCE, in the city of Athens. His name was Plato, and he was one of the most influential philosophers in the history of Western thought. Born around 428 BCE, Plato was a student of Socrates and the teacher of Aristotle. He founded the Academy in Athens, one of the earliest institutions of higher learning in the Western world, and his dialogues have shaped philosophy, science, and politics for more than 2,000 years. It is in two of these dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, both written around 360 BCE, that Atlantis makes its first and, for a long time, only appearance in the historical record. In Timaeus, Plato has the statesman Critias recount a story that was supposedly told to the Athenian lawgiver Solon by Egyptian priests during his travels to the city of Sais in the Nile Delta. According to this account, Solon visited Egypt around 590 BCE, and the priests there possessed records stretching back 9,000 years. Records that spoke of a mighty civilization that had existed in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which we today call the Strait of Gibraltar. This civilization, the priests told Solon, had been ruled by the descendants of the god Poseidon. It occupied a large island, greater in size than Libya and Asia combined, though scholars debate whether Plato meant Asia Minor or the entirety of Asia. The Atlanteans, as they were called, had built a city of extraordinary beauty and complexity. At its center stood a mountain, and around that mountain, Poseidon himself had constructed concentric rings of land and water, creating a series of circular canals that served both as defenses and as waterways for trade. The innermost island housed a magnificent temple dedicated to Poseidon, clad in silver and gold, with a roof of ivory and walls adorned with the precious metal orichalcum, a substance Plato describes as glowing red and second in value only to gold, though no material matching this description has ever been identified with certainty. The Atlanteans controlled a vast empire. They had subjected much of the Mediterranean world to their rule and had even waged war against Athens itself. But the ancient Athenians, according to Plato's account, had valiantly resisted and defeated the Atlantean forces. Then, in punishment for the moral corruption that had overtaken the Atlantean people, their pride, their greed, their abandonment of virtue, the gods sent a catastrophe of overwhelming force. In a single day and night of terrible earthquakes and floods, Atlantis was swallowed by the sea and vanished forever. This is the complete account as Plato left it. It is worth noting that Critias, the dialogue in which Plato describes Atlantis in greatest detail, breaks off mid-sentence and was never finished. We do not know whether Plato intended to continue it, or whether its incompleteness was deliberate, or simply the result of his death around 348 BCE. For centuries after Plato, scholars debated what he had meant. Was Atlantis a real place, a genuine memory of a lost civilization encoded in Egyptian records and passed through Solon to Plato? Or was it a literary device, a philosophical allegory crafted to illustrate the dangers of hubris and moral decay? A cautionary tale dressed in the clothes of history. Aristotle, who knew Plato personally and studied under him for 20 years, reportedly dismissed Atlantis as a fiction invented by his teacher. The geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, noted that some took the story literally while others did not and seemed to lean toward the latter himself. The question has never been definitively resolved, and that unresolved tension is part of what makes Atlantis so enduring. Through the medieval period, Atlantis faded somewhat from popular consciousness, though it was never entirely forgotten. It reappeared with force during the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration, when European navigators were venturing into the Atlantic and discovering lands previously unknown to them. Some scholars began to suggest that the Americas themselves might be the remnants of Atlantis, a theory that found enthusiastic support among those who marveled at the apparent sophistication of Aztec and Inca civilizations. The English philosopher Francis Bacon wrote a utopian novel in 1627 called New Atlantis, in which he imagined an ideal scientific society on a mysterious Atlantic island. A clear echo of Plato's myth transformed into a vision of Enlightenment progress. But it was in the 19th century that Atlantis truly exploded into modern popular consciousness, largely through the work of one man, Ignatius Donnelly, an American politician and writer who published a book in 1882 entitled Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Donnelly argued passionately and at great length that Atlantis had been a real place, the cradle of all human civilization, the origin of agriculture, metallurgy, writing, and religion, the common ancestor of cultures as far apart as Egypt and the Maya. He pointed to similarities between Old World and New World cultures, pyramids, flood myths, shared plant species, as evidence that they had all descended from a common Atlantean source. Donnelly's book was enormously popular and went through dozens of editions. It established the template for nearly all subsequent Atlantis speculation. A lost super-civilization of extraordinary advancement, destroyed in a catastrophe, whose survivors seeded the world's great cultures. This idea has proven extraordinarily tenacious, appearing in countless books, films, television programs, and internet theories ever since. From a scientific standpoint, however, the evidence for a literal Atlantis has always been vanishingly thin. The most fundamental problem is geological. The Atlantic Ocean floor has been mapped in considerable detail, and there is simply no evidence of a sunken continent of the scale Plato described. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is a volcanic mountain chain created by tectonic activity, not the remains of a drowned civilization. Plate tectonic theory, which has been extraordinarily well confirmed since its development in the 1960s, tells us that the Atlantic Ocean has been widening for approximately 180 million years as the Americas drift away from Europe and Africa. There is no mechanism by which a large island continent could have existed in the Atlantic 9,000 years before Plato's time, around 9,600 BCE, and then sunk beneath the waves in a single catastrophic event. The timeline also presents serious difficulties. 9,000 years before Plato places Atlantis at roughly 9,600 BCE, which is the end of the last ice age. At that time, human civilization as we understand it, cities, writing, agriculture, metallurgy, organized navies, simply did not exist anywhere on Earth. The most sophisticated human societies of that period were late Paleolithic hunter-gatherers. The first cities would not appear for another 4,000 to 5,000 years, and writing would not be invented for another 5,000 years after that. This does not mean, of course, that nothing interesting happened around 9,600 BCE. In fact, something very dramatic did happen at precisely that time: the end of the last glacial maximum and the beginning of the Holocene epoch. As the great ice sheets that had covered much of the northern hemisphere melted, sea levels rose dramatically, by as much as 120 meters globally over the course of several thousand years. This would have flooded vast areas of previously habitable land. The coastlines of the world looked dramatically different 10,000 years ago. The Persian Gulf was partly dry land. The North Sea was a great plain called Doggerland, inhabited by Mesolithic hunter-gatherers that only slowly became submerged. The area around the Black Sea may have been flooded catastrophically when the rising Mediterranean broke through the Bosphorus. These real geological events have led some researchers to propose that Plato's Atlantis story whatever its ultimate origin, may preserve a distant cultural memory of the flooding of coastal landscapes at the end of the Ice Age. This is not an unreasonable hypothesis. Flood myths appear in cultures across the world, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical story of Noah to the flood traditions of the indigenous peoples of the Americas and Oceania. It is at least plausible that the collective memory of a time when the sea swallowed vast stretches of land was preserved in oral tradition and eventually reached Plato in some transformed form. Several specific locations have been proposed as the real Atlantis over the decades. One of the most scientifically interesting is the island of Santorini, or Thera, in the Aegean Sea. Around 1600 BCE, Thera experienced one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history, a cataclysm that blew apart most of the island and sent tsunamis racing across the eastern Mediterranean. The Minoan civilization, centered on the island of Crete, just 110 kilometers to the south, was severely disrupted and may ultimately have been destroyed by this event. Some researchers have proposed that the memory of the Theran eruption and the decline of the Minoans, a sophisticated Bronze Age culture with impressive architecture, a writing system, and extensive trade networks, may have contributed to the Atlantis myth. The Minoans did indeed build on an island, did control a maritime empire, and were destroyed by a catastrophic natural event. The difficulty with the Thera hypothesis, as with all specific location theories, is that the details do not match Plato's account particularly well. Thera is in the Mediterranean, not beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The eruption occurred around 1600 BCE, not 9600 BCE. The Minoans were impressive but not the world-conquering empire of Plato's description. And the geography of the concentric rings and the central mountain, so precisely described in Critias, does not correspond neatly to any known location. Other proposed sites include the Azores Islands in the mid-Atlantic, the coast of Spain near Cadiz, the Bahamas, the Celtic shelf off the coast of Britain and Ireland, and even Antarctica. The latter proposal resting on the theory that Antarctica was once ice-free and that ancient maps preserve knowledge of its coastline. None of these proposals has found acceptance among mainstream archaeologists or geologists, and most have been effectively refuted. What archaeologists and historians increasingly believe is that Atlantis was a literary and philosophical creation, a brilliant piece of invented mythology in service of Plato's philosophical project. In Plato's dialogues, Atlantis serves as a foil for his idealized Athens. The Atlanteans begin as noble and virtuous people, children of the gods, but gradually succumb to greed, arrogance, and the corrupting influence of wealth and power. The ancient Athenians, by contrast, represent the virtuous, philosophically ordered society that Plato spent his career advocating for. The destruction of Atlantis is a moral lesson. Civilizations that abandon virtue and pursue power for its own sake will ultimately be destroyed. This interpretation fits perfectly with Plato's broader philosophical project. In works like The Republic, he argued extensively for the importance of justice, wisdom, and proper governance in creating a healthy society. Atlantis, on this reading, is not a historical account at all. It is a philosophical parable, as deliberately constructed as the allegory of the cave or the myth of And yet, the mystery persists. Not because the evidence supports a literal Atlantis, but because the human longing for a lost golden age, for proof that we were once greater than we are, for the possibility of a hidden history beneath the waves, is itself one of the most powerful and revealing features of human psychology. We are drawn to Atlantis not because it is real, but because it speaks to something deep within us. The sense that the world contains secrets we have not yet uncovered, that greatness can be lost, and that the past holds knowledge we have forgotten. There is something profoundly human in that longing, and in a way, it is also a kind of wisdom. Because there are things we have lost. Not Atlantean temples or orichalcum palaces, but species gone forever, ecosystems dismantled, languages spoken by no living person, songs that will never be heard again. The real lost worlds are all around us, in the thinning forests and bleaching coral reefs, in the accelerating disappearance of biodiversity that has taken hundreds of millions of years to develop. The earth we inhabit is the only wonder of the world that we know with certainty to exist, and it is the only one we have the power to protect. Atlantis may be a myth, but the impulse it awakens in us, the recognition that what we have can be lost, that beauty and complexity are fragile, that the sea can swallow what we take for granted, that impulse is pointing at something true. Let it remind you, gently, as you drift towards sleep tonight, that the world you wake up in tomorrow is worth caring for. That the ground beneath your feet, the air you breathe, the vast and ancient oceans that cover most of this planet, these are the real inheritance of every living being, and they are asking, quietly but urgently, to be protected. Sleep now. Let the waves carry you gently. Somewhere far below the surface of the water, the light is fading into darkness, and in that darkness there is only stillness and depth and the slow, ancient pulse of the sea. If this episode brought you a moment of peace or wonder, please consider leaving a rating. It means more than you know, and it helps us continue bringing these journeys to you. Thank you for listening to Sleep Journey Through Lost Worlds. Until next time.